Let's stay in the entertainment vein,
Yes.
more or less. Wrestling. Now,
Yes.
I grew up watching wrestling
I
on
did too.
WHBQ. Lance
Yes,
Russell,
indeed.
Dave Brown,
Indeed.
Sputnik Monroe,
That's right.
Jerry Lawler. But there's a gentleman you're going to talk about who sort of predates this era, but
That's
he was a
right.
major wrestler for
Indeed, the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly the 1930s, was the beginnings of wrestling in the United States, in professional wrestling. And Memphis, even then, was an important part of that wrestling circuit that existed. And one of the most interesting of these early wrestlers was a man named Big Jim Klinkstock. And Big Jim was a huge man who was known as a vicious wrestler. I mean, he crushed somebody's ribs one time in the ring using a body scissors hold. So he used his legs to crush this man's ribs. But he was normally a gentleman outside of the ring. Wrestled all across the South, but Memphis was his home base. And he developed a disease of the eye coming from sweat and powder that made it difficult for him to wrestle. So almost overnight, his career seems to be over. In the early 30s, he became acquainted with a man named Leo Kahn, who was very well known in Memphis. He owned a furniture and appliance store. He also hosted a popular radio program on WMC radio. Big Jim had become acquainted with Leo Kahn, and at some point he bought a stove. He and his wife bought a stove from Leo Kahn's store. So they were paying monthly installments on the stove, but then of course he develops this disease. He can't get good gig, can't get good wrestling matches. So he falls behind. And Leo Kahn becomes very angry at this. He goes to their house while Big Jim is away and tells his wife, I'm going to repossess this stove. And he says some very ugly things, curses her, and doesn't take the stove, but just comes and threatens to take the stove. Well, Big Jim heard about this and was not very happy, but about the same time, he got word that he was offered a wrestling match in St. Louis. And the amount of money he was guaranteed was going to be able to pay off all his debts, including his debt to Leo Kahn. So he goes to Leo Kahn's store to tell him, hey, I'm going to have your money in a couple of days. Well, he's not at the store. He's visiting a friend at the Hotel Chiska. So Big Jim goes to the hotel, and the two of them start talking, and he's explaining to him about he's going to have the money in a couple of days. But then the conversation turns, and Leo Kahn starts saying some things about Big Jim's wife that he doesn't like. And all of a sudden, Leo Kahn says something. Klinkstock would say later that he cursed his wife again. And Big Jim just grabbed him, pulled his glasses off, and just hit him. And Leo Kahn falls to the ground. He gets back up, and he hits him again. He falls down. And then Big Jim starts to kick him while he's on the ground very violently. The house detective comes and pulls him off. The police are called, but Leo Kahn is beaten so severely that he dies. So Big Jim is arrested, of course, and he is when they take his first photograph, he says to the newspaper photographers, he's still thinking about his career even though he's facing a murder charge, and he says, I want to take my shirt off because I never have my picture taken without my shirt with a shirt on. It was an odd thing, but that's what I guess wrestlers. He's wearing his tights, but he didn't have a shirt, so he takes his shirt off, and they take his picture. He's arrested. He's found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not murder, and spends a few years in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. Then gets out, and he and his wife first decide to settle in Nashville, but then they eventually make their way to Florida, and he dies under very mysterious circumstances. He goes to visit a dentist, and while the dentist is working on his teeth, he dies of a heart attack, just out of the blue. Yeah, it's a horrible way to go.
Yes, in the dentist chair, I don't like that.
No, that's right. I have to rethink my appointment.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, but it's just fascinating the way, the wrestling world, which is part fantasy, bleeds over into the real world.
Reality is always stranger than fiction, isn't it?
Yes, it is, indeed. That's right.
Is. Now, I'm old enough as a Memphian to remember the big department stores, Goldsmiths, Lowenstein's. As a matter of fact, my aunt worked for Lowenstein's. But you tell a story about a store. I've never heard of this store before, but apparently it was a big one back in the day.
It was. There were really 4 major department stores in Memphis in the first half of the 20th century. Goldsmiths, Lowenstein's, as you mentioned, also Gerber's and Breeze, which was spelled B-R-Y''S, which that doesn't look like Breeze to me, but it is what people, how it was pronounced. And it was owned by 2 brothers named Breeze and another man named Irving Block, or Ike Block, who came here in 1902, opened up a dry goods store. And in 1908, they moved to, they bought the Equitable building at Main and Jefferson and converted it into a department store and then added on as time went on. But Breeze is very significant because of some of the things that they offered, which was different from what Goldsmiths and Lowenstein's were offering at the same time in the 1920s and 1930s. Of course, there are 2 major transportation revolutions that are taking place in the early 20th century. The first is the automobile, right? So Breeze has a very well-stocked automobile department. In fact, you could actually build a car with what they had there. You could actually buy all the parts to make your own automobile, but also to service it as well. And it was probably the best automobile department or automobile store in the Mid-South at that time. A department store. We don't think in terms of going in and buying something that large or being able to have that sort of, we would think of an automobile store or a dealership where we would go. But at that time, things were still fluid, and a lot of people are selling automobiles. A lot of bicycle shops began to sell automobiles and auto parts. The other major transportation revolution really is the airplane, aviation. And Breeze is very confident, is very aware of how popular in the 1920s aviation is becoming. After the Great War, there are all these men who had been pilots in the Memphis area, out around Millington. Park Field had been an aviation training school for the Army during the war. So aviation was on a lot of people's minds. And so Breeze began to offer aviation parts. That you could go in and you could make a plane from, you could literally buy a plane
from the department store.
From the department store. You'd go in, and you take the elevator, men's wear, ladies wear, automobiles, get a plane. And yeah, that's fascinating and they had a huge impact on aviation in this community, because soon after they built an airport at Jackson and Warford, which was way out at that point. And this airport was it was the only one in the area. And in fact, it was so well known that Charles Lindbergh does a tour around the United States to promote aviation. And he comes to Memphis and he lands at Breeze Airport. And Jimmy Doolittle, the famed aviator, also lands and does an event at the Breeze Airport. And it survived until the spring of 1932, when a major windstorm, kind of sounds a little bit like Hurricane Elvis, that came through and damaged the airport so much that, and the city by that time in 1928,
they were forming their own.
We had a municipal airport. Yeah. That's right. So there was not as much traffic coming in by 1932, so they just abandoned it. Breeze also was an early promoter of television. The same year, in 1932, they worked out an arrangement with WMC Radio where images from their radio broadcasts would be transmitted to the Breeze Auditorium. I mean, the department stores at that time, you know, they didn't just sell things, they had events, fashion shows, events from celebrities. Celebrities would come to town, and they had an auditorium. They arranged for a transmission from WMC radio to their auditorium where images from the radio broadcast would be appear on a large screen. Now, it's not television the way we think of it. It was images that would be refreshed. So Breeze doing this is an example of introducing the concept to the people who never forget, and when television becomes available, people want it. And so Breeze plays a part in all of that as well.
Well, what happens to Breeze? Obviously, it doesn't exist today.
In the early 50s, they do some renovations of the store, increase its size a little bit, but they are sold to a company called City Stores, which is a national company, and that's happening a lot. In the late 50s, just really a few years after they had done this renovation, City Stores sells Breeze, and the building sits empty for several years until it's condemned in the early 1960s and torn down. You know, you sort of think that Memphis is the only place where a department store would think to sell automobiles out of their store, sell aviation equipment. I mean, I've not found that there was any other department store doing that. So I think that tells us something not just about Breeze, but also about Memphis as well.
And now, of course, we just hit the one-click button at Amazon. And
Right. Although I don't know that you can order a plane on Amazon.
Yeah, I don't think you can.
Yeah.
No, you can't do that. Things have changed.
That's
you
right.
know, what is it that fascinates you about stories like this?
There are two things. One, that they are widely unknown. So the excitement of being able to share these stories with people, and people will say, God, I had no idea that it either occurred or that it occurred in Memphis. And also, it gives us a better understanding of the past. And we have a tendency to see the past in very narrow terms. You know, sort of the timeline version, right? This happened, and this happened, and this happened. And we think, well, if this happened later on, it couldn't have happened earlier. There couldn't have been television broadcasts in Memphis in 1932 because it's not until 1948, 49. Well, that's not true, you see. So being able to connect all of those dots and explain just how complex history is. It's as complex as today. The benefit we have is we can look back and we can see how things relate to others and see how actually it does make sense because it connects to all these other things and leads to these other events. You know, we're sort of in a vacuum right now, but by studying history, we have a chance to sort of look back or step back and look at the broader picture, and it's a fascinating picture.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thank you, Wayne, for being on the Best
welcome.
Times and telling us about the history that we do not know.
You're very welcome. Thank you.